It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming to listen to me. I don't think I'm going to teach you anything vastly new or important today, because you know a lot of this, but I will try and put some of these things in a shape, at least that makes sense to me. I mean, testimony, a testimony, un témoignage, may have any kind of visible or audible or natural or human reality as its referent. I mean, for example, my continuing to wear a tie is testimony to the effects of a British education. And your smiling at that remark is testimony to the politeness of the citizens of Belgium. But obviously that's not what this conference is about. You know, we're using the word testimony almost as a code word for a particular range of historical experience. The kind of testimony that concerns us consists of first-person narratives of events which would count as evidence in a court of law if they were given as witness statements under oath. Save in exceptional circumstances, however, they are not uttered or intended for a court of law and are not used in that way, at least not directly. That's not quite what we call testimonial literature. We're dealing principally with texts that have qualities of gravity and authenticity that would lend weight to formal witness statements, but which are in very important respects quite distinct from them. So testimonial texts, in the sense in which we're using that word today, is not easy, or certainly not straightforward to translate. But I don't want you to think that that means that translating testimony in ordinary everyday courts of law is easy to translate. Quite the contrary. So I'd like to just preface my talk with a few remarks about the fragility of interlingual communication in any legal or quasi-legal environment. As I'm sure you know, indeed in all European jurisdictions, witnesses and defendants have the right to speak to the court in their preferred language. That's one of the basic language rights of the European Union. And to make this possible, qualified interpreters are provided in criminal cases. In civil cases, you have to pay for them yourself. Now, translating témoignage of that kind is a very stressful professional job. Even when it is well done, which is not always the case, alas, especially not in Britain, it remains a very approximate, almost paradoxical undertaking. The special difficulty of translating witnesses in court, and this is not entirely irrelevant to our kind of testimony, is this. Judges, in their summing up, routinely instruct the jury to pay attention not only to what witnesses have said, but to the way in which it is said. Okay? Seems very, in a monolingual jurisdiction, that seems terribly sensible, because, hesitations, slips of the tongue, changes of voice pitch, changes of volume, body language, facial expression, these all communicate shades of meaning that may significantly strengthen or weaken the credibility and significance of what the witness has said. I mean, as in ordinary conversation too. But that routine instruction to the jury creates something of a nightmare for interpreters and translators. Because language professionals, and I'm sure you all know this, do not, and normally must not, reproduce the way something is said, and it would likely cause a small riot if they actually did. For example, Khrushchev's banging, if the interpreter had banged his shoe on the table when Khrushchev was making this speech to the UNGA, well, exactly, it's ridiculous. You do not reproduce the way something is said as an interpreter or translator. Nowadays, it's very difficult, I know, here in Europe, because an interpreter giving the words of Donald Trump in simultaneous mode does not and must not mimic the president's grammatical mistakes, vocabulary errors, vulgar diction, and ugly hand gestures. It would be disrespectful. You'd get sacked. You can't do it. It's not just a convention, I think. I believe it is in the nature of translation to give the meaning of the source within the norms of unmarked, socially neutral, polite speech in the target language. And because of this unspoken, but I think virtually unbreakable and unbroken rule, A translator of testimony in a court of law is always falling short of providing the jury with the information that the judge thinks the jury should have. And for that reason, the best advice I've ever had from a court interpreter is this: if you have to get arrested, make sure you don't do it when abroad. So, I mean, the advice, and obviously the underlying meaning of the advice, is that there can be no real justice unless a trial takes place within a single language environment. The introduction of two languages always makes justice much less certain, much less deliverable. And I think that sets the broad stage for translating testimony in the sense which we want to give it today and what we're talking about. For it is manifest from 100 examples that the kinds of narratives that constitute historical testimony only rarely and quite exceptionally refer to events that take place within a single language community. Okay? Whether it's the suppression of the Anglo-Saxon nobility after the Norman conquest, the Highland clearances in 18th century Scotland, the Indian Mutiny of 1857, the conquest of the Incas, the pacification of Vietnam, or the slaughter of European Jews, humanity's worst behavior is typically exercised in a multilingual, not a monolingual space. Testimony to these great and bloody gashes in the course of centuries nearly always requires or relies on or actually takes place in translation. And that's the subject I'm talking about today. Translatedness is particularly marked, as I'm sure you all know, in the German assault on Jews between 1933 and 1945. Like Roman soldiers of old, the Nazis did not translate their own commands and regulations in the lands that they occupied, so the first level of their victims, ordinary French and Norwegian and Belgian and Polish citizens, were obliged to learn or half-learn the partly new dialect of administrative German called LTI, used by the authorities, and they lived in what I would call a kind of permanent and always terrifying state of semi-translation, of semi-uncertainty, that they had really understood what the orders were. But that was relatively benign. The millions who were then deported and held or enslaved in huge camps before being murdered spoke many more languages, or even greater variety of languages, not just the two involved in the occupation zones. Now, some of these prisoners coped by learning bits of other languages. They all learned bits of the oppressor's language, and from these fragments emerged a kind of camp language, a sort of rough and ready interlanguage. Primo Levi gives a memorable, sober account of this sort of fragmentary Eurospeak in the chapter called Communication, Comunicare, in The Drowned and the Saved, which is one of it's short, but it's a central text about how language worked in the camps. Other survivors of the camps have imagined that the accidental Esperanto of Auschwitz could have given rise to a greater sense of common heritage in post-war Europe. It could have been the seed of a kind of blending of languages, even to kind of common form that would have diminished the sharp divisions that had been part of the prelude to this tragedy. But that is not what happened. I mean, the blending together of these dialects in the camps did not lead to kind of Eurospeak in post-war Europe. Europe, indeed, reasserted its linguistic diversity and the right to linguistic self-definition, not just out of old habit and routine, but in a very conscious and quite unprecedented way. The Treaty of Rome of 1957 declared that each member state would address the European Commission in its own language, and conversely, that the European Commission would, and there's the actual wording of it, would address each member state in its own language. We take it for granted now, but it's actually unprecedented and extremely bizarre. I mean, there is no official language of Europe. All languages of Europe are official languages. So we have, since 1957, we have entered a kind of a world of permanent translatedness that is really quite bizarre, because all European documents now exist in 26 language forms, and they all have the status of originals. pre-1957, that was nonsense. I mean, you can't have 26 originals, but you can now, and you do. No European document has any legal force unless it exists in all those languages, until it's actually been produced in them. I would supplement this with perhaps an intentionally provocative corollary. I would say that no testimony of the Holocaust has any force unless it exists in other languages as well. So I'm going to go through a number of examples to demonstrate this. The first example is in 1945 in Paris. A few returned from the camps, reunited with people who'd never left Paris, but who came from the same bits of Central and Eastern Europe, and they formed new, sadly depleted communities, and one of the first things they did was to publish books of memory. These now rare volumes consist mainly of the old photographs that had survived, together with lists of the names of those who had died, with whatever other biographical details could be assembled. These books of memory were devoted usually to a village, but sometimes to a quarter of a city, even a street, actually, and they were published by voluntary associations of these things called Landsmannschaften, local groups. Although the title pages were typically in Hebrew, and the text often contained Hebrew prayers or excerpts from Hebrew prayers, the basic text, the basic language of these books of memory is Yiddish. Now, they were surely treasured by the immediate circle for whom and by whom they were written, but they never reached a wider audience. And the alleged silence of French Jews in the decade after 1945 is partly explained by the fact that the activities of the Paris Yiddish press never crossed the boundary of translation. These works just remained internal to the Yiddish community. Testimony made available in the language of the victims was inaccessible to the host culture, and in that sense could not really function as testimony. It almost doesn't really rise to the level of testimony except when translated and explicated, and that didn't happen for many decades. Second example, Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel's novel. There he is in 1946, 16-year-old. Incidentally, doesn't he look like Mechanicus? Extraordinary, actually, when I saw that. He wrote a novel called La Nuit, Night, appeared in Paris, 1958. It's part of the same phenomenon as the Anne Frank phenomenon, because there were several things happening. It's also when Primo Levi, If This Is a Man, was republished in Italian and met its public. But Night had an entirely different fate from those early Yiddish books of memory. Now, Wiesel himself was extremely polyglot. He'd grown up speaking Hungarian, Romanian, and Yiddish in Siget in Transylvania. He also knew biblical Hebrew at a young age. Obviously, he learned German in the camp. He was a bright lad, and he knew how to survive. And he was one of the 500 youngsters that de Gaulle brought back to France from Buchenwald. When Buchenwald was liberated, and nobody knew what to do with the youngsters there, the orphans. One of the gestures of France was to say, we'll take 500 boys. And Wiesel was one of those 500. Some of them are still alive in Paris. So he learned French in a flash, and actually he passed his baccalaureate in French at much the same age as an ordinary French boy would have done. He was barely 18 when he passed his French baccalaureate with top marks. Okay, he was lively, he was talented, and he was very angry. But he put all that aside and became a journalist, and 10 years after the liberation, in 1955, he decided it was time to write down his memories and what he felt and what he knew. He wrote it in Yiddish. He published it in Buenos Aires. That's about the time of his writing, and there it is, with a Polish-Jewish publishing house in Buenos Aires. So, "Und die Welt hat geschwiegen," which means, and it means either "and the world remained silent" or and the world fell silent. It's ambiguous between those two meanings, a little bit like in French, but in English we distinguish between them. It's a denunciation of the complicity of the Western world in the destruction of the Jews by the Nazis. Complicity by silence, by not doing anything. Now, maybe a few Argentinian Yiddishists read it. That's possible. But nobody in Europe could get hold of it. And if they had got hold of it, only the Yiddishists would have read it. And they, of course, already knew what Wiesel had to say. On his return to Paris from a journalistic assignment in South America, Wiesel, who actually wanted to interview Mendes France, the first Jewish prime minister of France, wangled himself an interview with Mauriac on the grounds that Mauriac was actually quite close to Mendes France, etc. Mauriac was a Catholic French novelist with a great big heart and a guilty conscience. We have no reason to doubt the story told by Wiesel himself that Mauriac urged the young man to rewrite his story and to tell it in French. Wiesel, however, did more than simply translate what he'd already written in Yiddish. He compressed it, he reshaped it, he de-biblified it, and he thoroughly Gallicized On die Welt hat geschwiegen. So La Nuit, which came out in 1958, contains the same facts and the same elements as the Yiddish original, but is a completely different book. It's not the first Holocaust novel. John Hersey's The Wall is almost certainly that. It's a few years earlier in English, but it's certainly the first Holocaust novel in French, or in Europe, I think. And it's certainly the first to achieve a worldwide audience in a whole series of subsequent translations. For the first 40 years of the book's existence, moreover, only a small number of Jewish scholars even knew that Night was a translation already, that there was a Yiddish pre-original. This wasn't exactly hidden, but I mean, nobody was told about it, and if you don't know Yiddish, you don't know. So it wasn't widely known. It wasn't known except to a small group of scholars. Now, Elie Wiesel's crossing from Yiddish to the French of the 1950s illustrates some of the politically sensitive issues that arise in translating testimony. Nobody in La Nuit wears a kippah. In the French novel, it's called a calotte, which is the skull cap that French priests also wear. In the camp, in Yiddish and in reality, there was a secret celebration of Shavuot. In La Nuit, it is referred to as Pentecôte, a festival that occurs on the same date. In the Yiddish pretext, there are frequent invocations of Old Testament passages, where the Yiddish can absorb bits of Hebrew quite easily, and it alludes to biblical passages and to Jewish prayers in Hebrew. These all disappear. They disappear completely in La Nuit, where the most striking intertextual references and allusions are to the most striking allusions are to Baudelaire. In fact, there are lines of La Nuit that are almost like a parody of Baudelaire. In fact, you think perhaps Baudelaire even wrote them, but he didn't. So, Wiesel knew what he wanted, and he knew what Mauriac wanted him to do, which is to get ordinary French people to take on board what had happened. And he knew how to do it by reacculturating his text and making it fit into the conventions of the contemporary French novel. In fact, a lot of the emphasis on silence in La Nuit sounds so much like somebody who's just been reading Beckett and Robbe-Grillet, as he had. It's very much a piece of writing of its period, and quite intentionally. Now, obviously, you could object that this almost complete assimilation is a betrayal of the specificity of the experience that Wiesel had lived through. And maybe it is, but it's also, and I take the other side, it's also the fact that the priority, Wiesel's own priority, was to be heard. And given the importance of what he had to say, being heard, or the ability to be heard, I think for him overrode and cancelled out the requirement of cultural authenticity. You might say also that it wasn't easy to be culturally Jewish in public in France in 1958. That's probably also true, but I think that's secondary. The main thing is to be heard and to write something that the French could accept as a French novel, but un roman vrai. La Nuit is really very special. It is a novel, but it is also it's an arranged document. It's a document arranged as a piece of fiction, or with the tools of fiction writing. Well, over the following 50 years, Wiesel's personal opinion about what he had done really went back and forth. He sometimes, he sort of had doubts and went round in circles. And so 50 years after the first English translation had appeared, Wiesel and his wife authorized a new translation, and indeed basically controlled the new translation, that re-injected into it some of the details and some of the stylistic features, not of the French, but of the Yiddish. And so the translation of Night that's now available in English is more like the Yiddish than the old translation, and much more like the Yiddish than the French, which of course hasn't changed, because that's Wiesel moved to the United States before La Nuit was published. He has carried on writing in French, but he's always lived in the United States since 1957, I think. So you have a very special situation there of a book that is and isn't a translation, and where what it is a translation of is an interesting story. Now, obviously, Elie Wiesel could do that because he was Elie Wiesel. Yeah? He's had to put up with a lot of criticism, some of it quite parallel to what we heard about the Anne Frank editors today. The far right has got hold of the discrepancies between the French, the Yiddish, and the English, used in exactly the same way to talk about Elie Wiesel as a fraud and a liar and so forth. But anyway, we translators cannot do any of the things that Elie Wiesel did with his own text. Yeah? We would not dare to de-Judaize an authentic testimony just to make it more palatable in French or in English or in whatever, or in Dutch. Nor would we dare to alter a novel, such as La Nuit, to make it more consonant with some external or pre-original text. We couldn't ourselves take on to retranslate La Nuit and inject the Yiddish back into it. That wouldn't be proper. So our remits as translators are much tighter than those of an actual witness, let alone of Elie Wiesel, who is, of course, the witness-in-chief, and also an extremely skillful writer. So it's a special case, and one that can't really set a model for our actions. Wiesel obscures many things in La Nuit, in the French text of La Nuit, and one of the things that he obscures, of course, is the multilingual nature of the experience of Auschwitz. That's smoothed out completely in the French text. But polyglossia is a striking feature of texts like Primo Levi's Survival. In America, it's called Survival in Auschwitz, if that is a man, si c'est un homme, of which hardly a page fails to contain words of either Polish or German or French or other languages, or perhaps all of them as well, on some pages. And that polyglossia of the experience of the Holocaust, of the actual historical reality of it, is something that worried Claude Lanzmann when he began to make and then to edit his 9-hour film that he finally titled in French with the Hebrew word Shoah, which in fact is the arrival of the word Shoah as a common or garden word. Before Lanzmann's movie, Shoah was just a word of Hebrew. It wasn't the word for what we now call the Shoah. It is an invention, if you like, in French. And Lanzmann is not a Hebraist by any means. He got the idea from, I'm not quite sure, from someone else. He doesn't know Hebrew well. Lanzmann's solution to the problem of the multilingual nature of the very experience is unprecedented, and I think it will probably remain forever unimitated. Breaking with the Wiesel model of hiding the languages used, Lanzmann displays both the languages in which the extermination was conducted and the tedious time-consuming acts of translation required to portray and present it. In the film Shoah, all the informants speak to camera in their preferred tongue: German, English, French, Polish, Yiddish, Hebrew, Czech, maybe one or two other. I think those are the main ones anyway. Landsman, the interviewer, speaks only French, except in one episode where he uses his... I was surprised how bad Landsman's German is, actually, because he's supposed to have a PhD from Heidelberg. But anyway, when he interviews the overseer from Auschwitz in his apartment with the hidden camera, there he speaks German, and there's no interpreter present. But in all other sequences, there is an interpreter present on screen. And his words are interpreted in front of us into Polish or Czech or whatever, and then the words of the interviewees are interpreted back. I'll just show you a tiny little episode.
Dis-moi, qu'est-ce que c'est la décoration de cette maison des portes? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire?
A co oznacza ta dekoracja drzwi na przykład?
Kiedyś to tak wyrabiali, to już dawno, już to było.
Avant, on faisait des sculptures comme ça.
C'est eux qui l'ont décoré comme
Ale
ça?
to państwo tutaj...
Nie.
Non, non, c'est un cœur des Juifs.
Ah, c'était des Juifs.
Te drzwi już może mają 100 lat.
Oh, cette porte, elle a au moins 100 ans.
Elle a au moins
monsieur.
100 ans.
Oui.
C'était une maison juive, ça.
Znaczy tutaj Żydzi dawniej mieszkali, tak?
To Rzeszy, cała Francja.
Oui, dans toutes ces maisons-là...
Toutes les maisons de la place étaient des maisons juives.
Dookoła tego placu, tak?
Całe, wszystko
Wszystko frontowe mieszkają te Żydzi.
Oui, toutes les maisons de devant, de face, étaient habitées par des Juifs.
Oui. Et les Polonais habitaient où?
A gdzie Polacy mieszkali?
poza tyły.
Podwórka.
Przy ustępach.
Dans les cours, là où il y avait les WC.
Ah, derrière, là où il y avait
Oui.
les WC.
Tutaj był kiedyś sklep.
Oui. Et ici, avant, il y avait un magasin, une boutique.
De quoi?
Z czym?
Spożywczy.
Avec l'alimentation.
Spożywczy, nie?
Tenus par des Juifs.
Znaczy żydowski. Oui.
Et alors donc, si je comprends bien, les Juifs habitaient devant les façades et les Polonais habitaient dans la cour avec les WC.
Znaczy tutaj Żydzi mieszkali raczej we frontowych domach, a Polacy raczej przy ustępach.
Tak,
Oui.
Zgadali się wszyscy. Polacy i
Madame dit que les Juifs étaient très belles.
Polaki to tak lubią Żydówki kochać, że nie wiem.
Les Polonais aimaient beaucoup faire l'amour avec les Juifs.
Et les femmes polonaises sont contentes qu'il n'y a plus de femmes juives maintenant?
Lubiały się kochać, lubiały.
Tak? Także
W moim wieku, tak jak ja, to już zaczynałam się kochać przed wojną, też cholery kochały się, także...
Qu'est-ce qu'elle dit?
non, elle dit que les femmes qui ont maintenant le même âge qu'elle
Oui.
aimaient aussi faire l'amour, voilà.
Et alors, les femmes juives, c'était une concurrence?
Też to była konkurencja troszkę, czy nie?
Polaki lubiały Żydóweczkę, cholera nam
Les Polonais aimaient les petites juives, c'est fou ce qu'ils les aimaient.
Et les Polonais regrettent les petites juives?
Także myśli pani, że ci Polacy żałują, że już nie ma tych Żydóweczek,
Pewno, że żałują,
Bien
takie
sûr.
ładne kobiety.
Bien sûr, les femmes si belles, bien sûr.
Et pourquoi, en quoi étaient-elles si belles?
Dlaczego były takie ładne?
Tam nie tylko Polacy są.
Ładne nie
Nie
robiły
tylko
nic,
Żydzi, bo tam i
dlatego, że
Polacy
Polki
są.
to
I
pracowały,
dzieci
a one
są.
to nic nie
I wszystko
robiły,
samochodami
tylko się
łodzi
ubierały
wozili.
i za to były ładne.
Alors, elles étaient belles parce qu'elles faisaient rien, les Polonaises, elles travaillaient, et les Juifs, elles ne faisaient rien, seulement elles pensaient à leur beauté, elles s'habillaient bien.
Ah, les femmes juives, elles travaillaient pas.
Także Żydówki raczej nie pracowały,
I w
tak?
ogóle nic.
Elles faisaient rien du tout.
Pourquoi ça?
Dlaczego nie pracowały?
Miały dobrobyt. Cała
Elles étaient
Polska
riches.
była w ich kapitale, to były, a my to musieliśmy służyć, pracować.
Elles étaient riches et les Polonais devaient les servir et travailler.
J'ai entendu le mot capital, elle a dit.
Poważnie.
Elle avait enfin, il y avait le capital qui était entre
Ah
les
oui,
Juifs.
ça tu n'as pas traduit. Repose-lui la question à madame. Le capital était donc entre les mains des Juifs.
Znaczy kapitał był raczej w rękach żydowskich, tak?
Wszystko, tak.
Toute la Pologne était dans les mains des Juifs.
Et est-ce qu'ils sont contents qu'il n'y ait plus de Juifs ici ou tristes?
Czy raczej uważa pan, że to dobrze, że już Żydów nie ma, czy raczej, że nie?
Żydów, że nie ma? No wie pani, nam nie przeszkadzały. Były, no w ogóle można powiedzieć, że jak wiadomo państwu, że Żydzi mieli cały przemysł w Polsce przed wojną, tylko Żydzi. Żydzi i Niemcy.
Ça ne les dérangeait pas de toute façon, mais comme vous savez, toute l'industrie en Pologne avant la guerre était entre les mains des Juifs et des Allemands.
Mais est-ce qu'il les trouvait sympathiques dans l'ensemble?
W ogóle raczej byli sympatyczni, ludzie uważali, że dało się z nimi żyć.
raczej, że były wredne dla nas.
Pour les Polonais, ils n'étaient pas très...
Nieuczciwi, no.
Et surtout, ils étaient malhonnêtes, ils disent.
Ils étaient malhonnêtes. Est-ce que la vie était plus gaie à Grabouf quand il y avait des juifs que maintenant?
Myśli pan, że tutaj życie w Grabowie było troszkę weselsze, jak ci Żydzi byli, czy teraz jest weselej?
Z tym to nie można za dużo mówić.
On peut pas en parler.
Il sait pas. Pourquoi est-ce qu'il dit qu'ils étaient malhonnêtes?
A dlaczego byli nieuczciwi? Dlaczego?
Proszę?
Co to znaczy, że byli nieuczciwi?
Żydzi?
Tak.
No bo oni, można powiedzieć, żyli na wyzysku Polaka najwięcej. Nazyskiwali.
Ils exploitaient les Polonais, c'est ça qu'ils vivaient surtout.
Comment est-ce qu'ils les exploitaient?
Ale co to znaczy wyzysk w tym wypadku?
No można powiedzieć, każdy zawód, najbogatsze były Żydy, a z Polaka ciągli cenę taką, jaką oni chcieli, jaką żądali. Dlatego była to, można powiedzieć, nie wyzysk.
Ils imposaient leur prix.
Et est-ce qu'elle regrette que les juifs ne soient plus là ou est-ce qu'elle trouve que c'est plutôt mieux?
Czy żałuje pani, że już nie ma Żydów, czy uważa pani, że to już jest raczej lepiej?
Ja jestem do szkoły, ja tylko liczę to, co, że mam dobrze teraz, to liczę na to.
Qu'est-ce que je peux en savoir? Je suis quelqu'un qui n'a pas d'études, alors je regarde seulement comment je suis maintenant. Maintenant, je suis très bien.
Est-ce qu'elle se trouve mieux?
A lepiej jak dawniej?
No pewno, że lepiej. Ja musiałam przed wojną kartofle kopać, handlę jajkami.
A dzisiaj
handlowali Żydzi.
Avant la guerre, elle devait arracher les pommes de terre. Tandis que maintenant, elle a un commerce d'œufs et alors va beaucoup mieux.
Mais ça, est-ce que c'est à cause du départ des juifs ou est-ce que c'est à cause du socialisme?
Ale czy to dlatego, że Żydów nie ma, czy dlatego, że jest ustrój teraz
A to
socjalistyczny?
już nie wiem, tym się nie interesuje. Grunt, że mam dobrze.
Ça ne l'intéresse pas. Elle est contente parce qu'elle elle est bien maintenant.
Obviously, doing it this way breaks completely with the traditions of translation in the cinema. Because, as you know, in movies, translatedness is erased. It's a convention. Not only the American, but also the French, no, all cinemas, they erase it for obvious reasons. In fiction films, foreigners speak the home language unless they're terribly evil when they speak it with an accent. In documentaries, non-English talking heads are either dubbed with lip sync, which is now quite rare, or they're given voiceovers or lecturing. That's to say, with the original being audible just in the background. So those are the conventions of the cinema. The actual presentation on screen of foreign language speech itself is rare, and unique to Landsman's film is the presentation of the act of translating into and out of the language of the film. The decision to make the translated nature of testimony the central subject as well as the central device of Shoah, well, it's one reason why the film lasts 9 hours. It doubles and often trebles the actual length of a sequence. And reciprocally, the impossible length of Shoah tells you why other movies do not do that, do not display acts of language transfer, even if they depend on such translations. But that's to do with the constraints of what we expect from the experience of going to the movies. We don't expect to come back at 3 a.m. and so forth, but it's not integral to the actual medium of film. You can do it, and Landsman shows you how you can do it. And I find it absolutely fascinating. It's not a solution that is going to be generalized. It creates, incidentally, quite extraordinary problems for the dubbing and subtitling of that film into languages that are not French. Because, you know, there's a multiplicity of directions for the subtitling to do. It also makes it, as it were, unpublishable in any other medium. The book Shoah, as published in English, is actually, it's just the subtitles of the English subtitling. It doesn't actually give you a first idea of what Shoah is like. And even the book Shoah in French, with its introduction by Simon de Beauvoir, is a tiny fragment of what it is that Landsman has created. And above all, it leaves out this extraordinary, I mean, what it tells you is how ponderous it is to interpret, how difficult it is to extract testimony, how difficult it is to bear witness through this process, and to do it honestly and authentically. So that's my third example of the place of translation in testimony. Fourth example we've already heard a little about, and I shall repeat myself very slightly, is Georges Perec and W, or the Memory of Childhood. That is a work that masks not just language transfer, but the very language of the events to which it refers indirectly. W was written in bursts between 1969 and 1975. Perec was born in 1936, so he's a man sort of coming to terms with almost being middle-aged. Approaching his 40th birthday, which worried him terribly. It's an unusual book, as you know. It's made of alternating chapters of fiction and memoir, printed alternately in Roman and italic face. Now, having been born in 36, Perec's young life was affected by the occupation and by discrimination, but not very much, because he was a very little boy. But his muddled and fragmentary memory of it doesn't correspond to what most people think of as testimony. I mean, he didn't see anything terrible happening, or he doesn't remember seeing anything terrible happening. He saw one German officer who visited his school and inspected it and then went away again. And all he claims to recall of the thousands of flying fortresses that roared overhead the Vercors when there were the landings in the south of France in 1944, all he really remembers of that and of the vicious combat between the resistance and the retreating German army is a playground trade in parachute silk. Because the boys collected the parachutes and they traded the silk. That's all that you sort of, where did these parachutes, etc. You can sort of work it out, but he doesn't say anything more than that about it. But this, W is all the same an immensely important work. It's part of that hinge in the memory of the Holocaust that occurred around the mid-1970s. There were a whole clutch of works, including, that come between 1975 and 1980. It is, in a subtle and indirect way, a profound testimony to the moral and psychological damage wrought by crimes committed in World War II. Because of that, and because of the way it manipulates the reader into a shared sense of guilt, it's a great challenge to translate it into any other language. Now, it's nearly 30 years since I did that, and I don't think I quite realized at the time how delicate my job actually was. Quite a lot of retrospective learning goes on with a book of that kind. Most of the fiction chapters of W are set on an imaginary island off the southern tip of South America, the island itself being called W. It's, where have I put the clicker? Oh, here we are. Thank you. The island society is structured entirely around the Olympic cult of sport, and its population is descended from Northern European settlers having names with an Anglo-Saxon or more frequently Germanic ring to them. The ethnographic description, or fictional ethnographic description of this rule-governed society turns step by step, chapter by chapter, into an allegory of arbitrariness, cruelty, and destruction. And by the last chapter, the book is clearly talking to us about the death camps of the Nazi era. I mean, some people twig early, some people twig late, but by the last chapter, you cannot not have understood what this is really about. The alternating or interleaved memory chapters, for their part, tell us indirectly that the child Perec had to suppress all memory of his having been Jewish, otherwise he could not have survived in that school, and by unmistakable implication that he can no longer actually remember most of what he is telling us about, because forgetting was the mot d'ordre, was what he was required to do. His mother had stayed behind in Paris, and it's his mother whom Perec cannot really remember. She was rounded up and deported to Auschwitz, from which she never returned, and that is the document that Perec was finally able to obtain to confirm this. When he was asked in an interview later on, after the publication of the book, why he had chosen to place his allegory in South America, of all places, Perec said it was because he could use it to talk about Germany without ever using the word Germany. It's not quite true. The word German does actually occur twice in the text, but you get the point. In this kind of artfully constructed psychological testimony, words may serve to hide other words. The function of some of the words is actually to be stand-ins for others that he doesn't want to mention. Here's an easy example of how that actually happens in W. One of Perec's later memories is of fetching the newspaper from the kiosk one morning in May 1945, and then running home, shouting out loud, "Japan has capitulated." Okay? Of course it's wrong. It's obviously wrong. In May 1945, Germany capitulated. And for people of Perec's generation, and my generation, the error is so crass that it's obvious. What he meant to do was to make you, the reader, shout out, "Mais l'Allemagne! Pas le Japon, l'Allemagne!" Which is what he wanted. He wanted you to think of Germany without his ever having to say it. For a translator or an editor or editing translator to do what we might have done with Ellenberg, for example, or we might have done with Anne Frank, and put a footnote saying this is wrong, that would be absolutely the opposite of what you should do. You have to leave Perec's mistakes because they are part of a plot, part of a design, part of a deceptive, perhaps not entirely ethical abuse of the reader, but that's the sort of book that it is. You can't improve. It's not a sloppily written student essay. It's a very carefully crafted work in which, well, and you get a little paranoid then. You begin to wonder whether every tiny mistake, every tiny muff in W is crafted and intentionally put there. And frankly, I do not know the answer to that. I just know that most of them have a function. The constructed gaps and slips in W bring into clearer focus, I think, the special status of testimony in translation, or of translation in testimony. And nobody's recall is perfect. Memories of traumatic events may be even less reliable than most. Yet the things not said, or the things consciously and unintentionally omitted, the mistakes in names, in spellings, in dates and events, are themselves part of the authenticity of testimonial literature. Okay, that's what makes them authentic, because somebody who remembers the historically accurate truths is probably not remembering, but looking things up. So you have to ask, did Perec insert mistakes so as to provoke his readers into realizing that all alleged memories are subject to error? Or did he really retain memories that were so wide of the mark as to be ridiculous, such as remembering a Hebrew letter that isn't in the Hebrew alphabet, that doesn't exist? I mean, remembering a film title that actually belonged to a book about a different subject. Remembering a symbol that does not appear in a very famous Charlie Chaplin movie. Or remembering having been given a Chaplin comic at the Gare de Lyon in 1942, when there were no Charlie Chaplin comics at the Gare de Lyon in 1942, because under Nazi occupation, Charlie Chaplin was completely banned because the Nazis, erroneously moreover, believed he was Jewish. So, how many corrections may a translator make to a flawed original? How much more authentic would it be if, in the English version of W, he did not receive an obviously false Charlie Chaplin comic? Or how less authentic, etc. These are really, really difficult questions to answer. Is any correction to testimony a betrayal of its authenticity? Or is it a betrayal of the authenticity of that document to leave it with obvious flaws that will discredit it with an audience that knows just one or two facts about history? The issue of translation as improvement was particularly hard to solve for a remarkable document that I translated much more recently, 10 years ago. This is a journal of Ellenberg that we've already talked about, and which is going to be my my last example of the problems that arise of translating testimony. So you could say that Wiesel's approach represents one extreme of adaptation and assimilation. Per XW can be seen as the most extreme distortion of that central form, where facts are altered for literary purposes. But Hélène Bair's journal is at another sort of extreme point, because it's a first-person account of much the same years by someone who simply did not know what was happening to her or to her world, and who never had the benefit of hindsight to make sense of it, in order to bear witness. She was the daughter of a prosperous and distinguished Jewish family. She was a student of English literature at the Sorbonne, and she began her diary in 1942. At the start, it's a young woman's diary, worries about her boyfriends, about her friends, about her family, about her clothes, sorts of things that young women put in their diaries when they start a diary. It's absolutely not intended to be testimony, and we are not supposed to be reading it. In fact, up until the time the diary begins, from the point of view of Hélène Bair, there is nothing much to give testimony of. She lived in very elevated cultural and social circles. And as far as she was concerned, life was going on more or less as normal. And of course, she didn't know that for us now, that itself is important testimony. The separation of the Jews into the French Jews, who considered themselves the saved, and the foreign Jews, who were the damned, in those early years of the occupation, is not our retrospective imposition of a kind of a class-conscious understanding of history. It's the plain and obvious truth to Mademoiselle Hélène Bair. Things were indeed happening that were not very pleasant, but they weren't happening to her, because she was French, and because her father was a hero of the First World War and a leading figure in French industry, and she was related to just about everybody who was anybody in the law, in the university, and so forth. The first shadow comes almost unnoticed. After a long self-examination about whether or not to share her peine de cœur, her emotional troubles, with her mother, Hélène notes in her diary entry for April the 11th, 1942, I don't want to hurt Maman. Already this evening, Papa got an expropriation notice, and Maman is taking it all on herself and keeping it all under wraps. Whereas, you know, the expropriation notice is just the straw that might break the camel's back, but she doesn't realize. She really doesn't, and it's terrible to read this. I mean, it's almost unbelievable, but you have to believe it, because this is a diary. This is not a novel. This has not been arranged. It then breaks off from this ominous event, because it really is ominous. The expropriation notice. He was the owner of the établissement Kuhlmann, which then merged with Péchinet and Eugène to form Péchinet Eugène Kuhlmann. It's a huge, important industrial enterprise. Just expropriated. Oh dear. She breaks off from this to say, let's think about something else, about the unreal beauty of a summer's day. You think, you know, is she inhuman? Doesn't she realize? Well, yes, she is very human. And the very lightness of her mood is testimony to the diabolical deceptiveness of the campaign to exterminate the Jews. Hélène hadn't noticed yet, and that's such an important fact for us to know. It explains many things. Just as extraordinary and unbearably real is the entry for the 1st of June, 1942. Maman came to tell me the news about the Yellow Star, and I pushed her away, saying, I'll talk about that later. But I knew there was something unpleasant at the back of my mind. It turned out that something unpleasant has to do with boyfriends. It's hard to bear. We are accidental readers of a diary written with complete candor and without hindsight. And the heavy hand of historical irony knocks us back time and again. The irony here is not an intention of the text. It is a creation of history. It is the poisoned fruit of what came next that we know about and she didn't. Hélène's disregard of signs that we now know to be ominous portents of the coming slaughter tells us more directly than perhaps any other source what it was like to be alive, Jewish, cultivated, a bit supercilious, and 21 years of age in the summer of 1942. In so doing, it explains to us why so many didn't even think of escaping. Obviously, it's a rare and precious document, and it has to be translated with care and with respect. But the challenges that it sets us go beyond that, and they have to do with the very language of the text, or rather, with the languages of the text. And I am overrunning a bit, and I'm very sorry, but I do want to deal just with my next section, and then I should abbreviate somewhat. I'd already told you Hélène was a student of English. Yeah? She'd read much more English than she'd read French. Yeah? She was virtually bilingual. She wrote essays on Shakespeare. She was planning to do a thèse de doctorat on Keats. One of her part-time jobs was as librarian in the English department library in the Sorbonne. So she was actually completely wrapped up in English poetry and fiction of the 19th and early 20th centuries. She gives her friends nicknames from English novels she's been reading. And she quotes in English from memory without looking things up. It's just natural to her. Now and again she makes mistakes. But more frequently, in fact, the editors of her long-lost manuscript make mistakes in reading her handwriting in English when reading words not in French. So there are two tiny little issues here, or rather two issues, one of which is tiny. When translating from French into English, what do you do with the English already in the French text if it is wrong? Well, correcting seems disrespectful when so much of the weight of Hélène's testimony lies in the things that she barely notices. On the other hand, leaving misspelt English in the translation into English is going to be read in one of two ways. It's going to be read as an error made by the editors of the English translation. Or it's going to be read by the most generous of one's readers as a flaw in Hélène's testimony. And so for both reasons, I think it's not worth leaving those kinds of mistakes in the translation. And I'm quite happy to correct Hélène Baird on issues of quotations from Shakespeare and Keats and Conrad and whatever, where she gets the word in, whether either she or editors gets the word slightly wrong. I think it's ethically and literarily quite a different issue from correcting Georges Perec, where there is a high degree of consciousness in the mistakes that are inserted. But it's true that this judgment is not a judgment in principle, and it's not really a traductological issue. It's based on criteria of respect and understanding that are external to the works themselves. They come from who Georges Perec is and what kind of a text this is. And you could also just call it mere prejudice, that, when Perec doesn't make mistakes, so the mistakes he makes are part of the text, and prejudice that Hélène Baird, she's just a young student of English, and of course she makes mistakes. You could call that prejudice as well. But the second, much more serious problem is the one that arises with all multilingual texts, and I've said, in principle, all Holocaust testimony are multilingual already. And it's been mentioned a couple of times today already. We're accustomed to conceptualizing translation as an operation that involves a source and a target, L1, L2. As I never tire of pointing out, almost all texts, but certainly all Holocaust texts, always involve a language that is neither L1 nor L2, and that I call L3 or L4 or L5. That's to say, when you get German words in English, or French words in a German text and so forth. What to do with L3, what to do about L3 is a standard conundrum in translation practice and in translation theory as well. The chestnut example is, what do you do about the French in Tolstoy's War and Peace? Yeah. When translating into English, do you translate the French into English, or do you leave it as French, etc., etc.? The problem is more difficult when L3 is L2. That's to say, when your original source already contains chunks of the target language, and in Hélène Bell's diary, when you're translating into English, it contains a lot of English already, even when it's been corrected. There is no sense to translating expressions like singleness of mind, or inner haze, or captain of my soul, that she uses in the French. Yet, by not being translated, these foreign bodies are obviously transformed. For a start, in the English translation, these fragments are no longer in a foreign language. Makes it quite different. They're not perceptible as separate from the text. They no longer connote higher education, cosmopolitan culture, and a degree of snootiness as well. The English simply cannot avoid being plainer than the French, being less variegated, since it's all in English and not in a mixture of French and English. It's plainer, it's also more accessible. But by reducing the polyglossia, the multilingualism of the text, it also makes it a less interesting testimony of the cultural world of which it speaks. There's less relief, there's less profile, there's less information, in fact, given by the translation. One of the most excruciatingly ironical scenes in the diary is Hélène's record of a visit made to the English Library of the Sorbonne by a German officer who was a scholar of English, and the language that he shares with the librarian, namely Hélène Bert, a French Jew, is of course English, the language of the enemy or of the ally, depending on which side of the table you happen to be at that moment. The use of English as a vehicle of communication between a French Jew and a German officer is something that, for logical reasons, as well as practical reasons, cannot be replicated in English. You just can't get the irony and the meaning of it in English. You can explain it, you can put a footnote, you put it in the intro. That's one of the reasons I had to do so much paraphernalia around the text, but you can't actually reproduce it or represent it. And translation of testimony necessarily falls short where the testimony reflects the social, ethical, and political meaning of the actual languages in which it is given. But there is one perhaps unique and very touching translation crux arising in the Journal of Hélène Bert, and it's with this that I really will stop. We are in December 1943. Over the preceding 18 months, Hélène's eyes have slowly and forcefully been opened. She now knows what she is facing. Not exactly. I mean, she knows that the deportations from Drancy are not taking Jews to new lives in the East where they're going to become farmers and whatever, as the propaganda still insisted. She doesn't know exactly what lies at the end of the line, but she knows it's not good. A contact warns her that everyone of her kind, meaning all Jews, will be rounded up before the end of the year, and urges her to do something. But what can she do? There are not many Jews left in Paris, she notes, and she feels as if she is part of la dernière fournée, the last batch. I used the word shovelful, the last shovelful. J'ai l'impression que nous sommes de la dernière fournée, that we're in the last batch. And I use that word shovel, or shovelful, to associate Hélène's intuition with our own later knowledge of the shovels used for unspeakable purposes in the camps that Hélène herself cannot quite conceptualize. You could say I'm cheating. I'm laying it on a little bit. It's a concession to the supposed aim of translators to create in the reader an impression as near identical to the one that a reader of the original would have. But the only readers this original had were in 2008, by which time that impression is already there. It's no doubt in my mind that in French, the word fournée today, in the context of Holocaust testimony, has echoes of a quite specific kind. And that word fournée occurs again very near the end. Hélène was arrested in March 1944, and in February 1944, when almost all her friends have been arrested and deported already, and the tragedy has become unrelievedly dark, her colleague, Madame Levy, asks her how things are going. J'ai répondu, ce n'est pas drôle. Well, I could have doubted how to say ce n'est pas drôle, say it's no joke, or things aren't exactly funny, or we are not amused. But I just went for the plain dialect-neutral, verbless, not good. Then to dispel Hélène's well-motivated gloom, Madame Levy tries to sound cheerful and says, allez, ne vous en faites pas, nous sommes de la même fournée, nous ferons le voyage ensemble. Yes, it's painful, isn't it? I mean, the words themselves contain the story. The word fournée, which I'd previously translated as shovelful, sounds more ominous here than it did before. I mean, literally, une fournée is a measure of the quantity required to fill an oven. Yeah? So you could call it a batch or a tray full of cakes. But Madame Levy does not know what lies in store at the end of the train ride, and yet, you know, the French language seems to know for her. To say in English, we'll be in the same oven, is to go too far, is to over-translate, and is wrong as well, because Madame Levy doesn't know that that is so. But to say we'll be in the same batch in English makes the oven of fournée disappear. So what can you do? And I decided that here, and perhaps nowhere else, the translator's choice must be not to translate. And so I actually left this in French, just as there is no way of translating the use of English quotations when translating into English, there is no way of bringing the network, the delicate network of associations of this word into any other language. It's that word that matters. So I left that one sentence in French. Okay? So, in a curious way, this wonderful, extraordinary wartime diary that never leaves Paris brings us back to the difficult language issues that arise in the translation of much more obviously polyglot testimonial texts. No text of any length is actually completely in one language. There's always an L3 somewhere in it. But historical testimony, and more especially the testimonial documents arising from the European disasters of the 20th century, are inherently multilingual, and they either display or imply acts of translation at every turn. What I like to think that the Journal of Hélène Baird shows us is that even in a text that cries out to be translated and shared, there are some brick walls between forms of speech that cannot ever be completely knocked down. And we don't meet them very often. I mean, I think everything is translatable in principle. Every now and again, you do actually come up against one of these brick walls, and it's translators who are the people, and who must be the people, who know when to stop and to turn away and to say, we leave this as it is. Thank you.